Good afternoon. We are here just after 1 o'clock on Tuesday, February 28th, and we are going to take testimony today on this report, which is for the Vermont Land Access and Opportunity Board. We have a couple of different witnesses, including the attorney who helped write the report. But committee, just to give us a background on this report. We have been working on what we've been calling social equity legislation for the last several years, pretty front burner. So this is another step along the way, and I just wanted to share, Reverend Mark Hughes sent us an email in our legislative email boxes today, and I'm cribbing from his work, but just to give you an idea of how this committee came to doing social equity issues. It first started under the rubric of general, because we hadn't identified something as such. And then take this off. And then we ended up getting legislation, as we do over the years, asking us to do different things. Out of that came legislative initiatives like the slavery constitutional amendment that we voted on in November, but that was a 4-year process to change our constitution. So that started 5 years ago. There has been equity in cannabis taxation and regulation was a bill that was passed in 2020 addressing the inequities that have come from the drug trade, the anti-drugs movement. Bless you. And then there was a resolution that mentioned that came to a conclusion that racism is a public health emergency, which was an important declaration for this legislature to make, and to, along with the Health Equity Advisory Commission, they were resolutions which do not have the force of bills, but they have a force of intent to say that one of the jobs of this legislature is to dismantle what we perceive to be systemic racism. And that led in this committee, some of these led in this committee to the public apology that we made about the eugenics survey, which, due to the way records were kept, we were as specific as we could be in terms of identifying folks who we were actually apologizing to. And that was an apology done by the General Assembly, by the House and Senate, not by the executive branch yet. And it was, and the thing we learned about public apologies, and the textbook I used is up here on our bookshelf, is apologies without actions are empty. And we knew from that point on that we needed to address different issues in different ways, but we had to address them. And so from this committee came the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which we passed last year. But while those are general ideas and very, broad, they're very broad bills in terms of creating the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. While it's never been done, it was a futuristic look on how are we going to address these issues. And the process for that, we took testimony from the woman who is running the selection panel now, and they expect to have offers out and the commissioners hired by the end of March. But we also had bills that were pretty aspirational in terms of creating programs in the here and now. And out of those bills, whether they were money put aside for economic development for people of color or other people that we've decided who are in research that are oppressed. And Mark will go into some of these with greater detail than I can, but the Land Access Opportunity Board came out of a long discussion last year with S226, which was one of our omnibus housing bills. It started in the Senate and then came over to us after crossover. And the Land Access Opportunity Board was a creation done because there's a certain reality right now in discrimination law and the way that we try to get funding or programming to particular folks, and the way that we've had some testimony on discrimination policies, and we have some bills that'll be dealing with discrimination policies coming up. But last year, this conversation became more difficult because it was part of a larger idea, which was how do we, if we've decided that there's systemic racism, and if there's a way that in the case of wealth created by access to land, whether it's purchasing or whether it's just having access, just physical access to it, the idea of having putting aside money for a particular group of people by name is discriminatory. We're seeing the Supreme Court rule this way. We're seeing contemporary jurisprudence go this way. Is there, and so the question was, well, the first stop was, well, we don't know if that's constitutional or not, if we can put that much money, any money away with this specific purpose in mind. And so this Land Access Opportunity Board was created, and it was hosted by VHCB. They agreed to host it and provide administrative backup, and we granted funds to the board, and they were able to hire an attorney to help them write this report, which was, and Mark will go into the details of the report, but it's a first step. And while this is a first step for this particular process, I just really wanted to emphasize that the work that we've been doing to get to this first step has been pretty lengthy, pretty thorough, and yet still incomplete. And this is just another piece that we're trying to figure out, is there even a way, I mean, to put it in the blankest of terms, is there even a way to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish here? And I'm appreciative of Trey Martin is here from VHCB, and Gus Seelig is on the list as well today. They, by agreeing to host the program and fit into their mission, I'm really appreciative of the process, though, to create this board. And it's something that hasn't happened like this before. And with some, with some growing pains, as all new commissions have, getting to know how you're working and who you're working with. The work that they put out in this report, I think, is top notch. And I think and that's why I invited them in. The goal is to make this board more permanent and to consider the funding that is being requested, so that we can comment on it in our budget memo as well. Any questions for me before I turn the microphone over to the folks who actually experienced this, this end product? I mean, this was our experiences that got to this point, but now, once it passed and once it was put out on the table, it became their baby. Any questions on this right now, or shall we just go right to Mark? So, Reverend Mark Hughes, please join us if you will. Or do you want to start?
Mr. Chair, just as a quick introduction, I'm Trey Martin from ACB, and sure, Polly. I will run the slide deck and mostly be quiet today, but just wanted to introduce some folks who are in the room and on the screen. So Reverend Hughes is here, and will be delivering a lot of the testimony, but on screen today, you'll also see Robert Appel. Robert is the attorney that the board hired to assist them in the preparation of this report and the legal analysis that underlies the report. Gus Seelig, the director of the ACB, is also on screen, and he will, the sequence today is that Reverend Hughes will start off, hand it off to Robert, back to Reverend Hughes, and then Gus will have the last slide. We're also joined, though, by two additional board members, Jess Laporte, who's appointed by the Everytown Project in Vermont, and Kirsten Murphy, who's the director of the Vermont Developmental Disabilities Council. And they're just here in a supportive role, but if you have questions about the work of the board as we finish up, we're all here to try and help answer and help inform your decision making. So thank you for the chance to say say hello to everybody. I haven't been in this room before with you all, and I know Gus and Polly have, but we really appreciate your support.
It's not enough anymore in the short time that you have actually been there, like, if I say you're the new Jen Holler, half of us aren't going to even know what that means. Can you just reassociate ourselves with
Yes.
how you fit into the VHCB puzzle?
Not even enough to say that I'm the new Jen Holler, because Polly Major, who's here from VHCB, is really the new Jen Holler. She's the director of our advocacy and policy work at VHCB. My role at VHCB is as the director of conservation and rural community development. But when Jen, who many of you knew for many years, retired from VHCB last June, I had worked in the building a lot in my career, and so I've helped to bridge from Jen's departure to Polly's arrival.
Real new Jen.
Yes. A professional version of Jen, which I wouldn't be for you all. I'm really the crazy guy who's interested in birds and wildlife corridors. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, we are so lucky to have Polly, who joined us from Senator Leahy's staff, where housing was one of the portfolios that she managed for the senator. So you may have interacted with her through that lens over the years.
All right. No, thank you for setting this up.
Yeah. And yeah, I'm going to turn it over to the people who've got a lot to say to you all. And thank you. You just connected the dots, didn't you?
Reverend Hughes, before we get started, I'm going to zip around the committee room to introduce us to everyone who's here in the room who may not have been before. Representative Tom Stevens from Waterbury.
Representative Saudi Lamont, Milwaukee, Washington District.
Joe Parsons, Newbury, Topsom, and Groton.
Emily Krasnow, South Burlington.
Ashley Bartley, Fairfax, and most of Georgia.
Caleb Elder, Starksboro, Bristol, Lincoln, and Moncton.
Dennis Labonte, Linden, Sutton, Newark, Sheffield, Wheelock.
Wow, that's a lot.
I'm Elizabeth Burrows, and I represent Windsor 1, which is Heartland, West Windsor, and Windsor.
And I'm Larry Labor, and I represent Essex, Orleans County, District 1.
I'm Mary Howard, and I represent Rutland District 6.
And Robin Chestnut Tangerman, representing Middle Sound Springs, Paulet, Tinmouth, Rupert, and Wells.
And I'm Reverend Mark Hughes, and I'm representing the Land Access Opportunity Board. I'm the executive director of the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance. I also do a couple of other things in my spare time. I happen to also be the commander of Howard Plant Post 782, the Veterans of Foreign Wars in Vermont, in Burlington, the oldest post in Vermont, 102 years old now. And in my off time, I'm also a minister at New Alpha Missionary Baptist Church in Burlington. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And for those of you, is there anyone in the room who did not receive an email from me this morning? My mother told me ask the right questions. Did you read it?
Yes.
So thank you again for having me, and thank you for responding directly to me. I really appreciate the direct response. And I think that just where to start, the chair did a pretty good job at explaining where we're coming from. And you said you were kind of riff off me. It sounds to me like you wrote it. So I don't think there's much more for me to cover there. I think that saves a little time. I will drop back a little bit just to throw a couple things at you in opening, because the unemployment rate for Black folks has been twice that of white folks since it's been on record. Hard stop. 13 homes are owned by Black people in Burlington. 13. In Burlington. That's it. 0.02% of farmland is owned by Black folks in this state. 0.02% of farmland is owned by Black folks in this state. So I could go on and we could talk more about housing and the disparities that exist there. We could talk about education. We could talk about economic development. We can talk about employment. We could talk about health services. We could talk about transportation. We could talk about the criminal justice system. But Time doesn't allow us to do that, nor does vocabulary permit me. What I can tell you is that thankfully, and thanks to you who are in the room, and I know that there are, I want to say upwards of maybe 9 of you who were not sitting in this room last year, and there's probably 4 that were not even in the building. But what's memorialized in this room, and the same thing that's memorialized with the legislature, you get to inherit, which is cool, because you get the thanks today. You get to receive our gratitude for the work that you have done, even though you weren't here. Your committee and who you are as a legislature, you have done this and you're continuing to do this. So I came to just tell you thank you. Thank you for your work. We got a lot of work left to do, but it is tough work. It's not easy. It's very difficult, hard conversations and stuff like that. But I just want to first and foremost thank you. I want to cut over to the slides real quick and spend a little time talking about, yes, I don't know what's behind me, but I'm going to assume it's the context. We're going to kind of fly through that because I think that's already been established in terms of a lot of the things that we've done. But just to kind of put a fine point on it, when we created Susanna Davis's position, the Racial Justice Alliance, when we introduced that policy in 2018, we had envisioned that it would be in office and we thought it would also be independent. So we're mindful that she is a political appointee. We're mindful that her task is only focused on racial justice. That is, her task is focused on systemic racism. That's just one of several categories that we're dealing with in this particular policy and in all policy when we talk about equity. There's the disabilities community. There's also, as you know, the LGBTQIA community, which we partner with. That's where we build power together. If we're not all winning, we're not all winning. So I just want to make that clear. I am here speaking as the executive director of Racial Justice Alliance. I have a tendency to fall back on the discussion on systemic racism. Just keep in mind that I do mean it to be a broader discussion. Fair enough? So if you look at some of these things that are on this list, you'll see Health Equity Advisory Commission, which I actually chair as well. And don't pat me on the back because we're having a tough time over there, but we're working through it and we're making progress. Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it's coming up, and all this other work that's happening. And what I think the main point was not just to get you to see that we started somewhere, we're on a trajectory, we're on a velocity, and we're going somewhere, but also that it's not linear, that there's a lot of other things that are happening. There's an economic justice policy that we're putting forward. We're actually coming back to amend the Constitution with equal protection clause this biennium as well, and other initiatives. So there's a lot of things that are moving in a lot of different directions. You know, Act 250, you shouldn't be able to talk about it without thinking about equity. There's a whole lot of things that are moving around, and sometimes it's confusing. So I just want to make sure that what we're looking at is, this is, I think the chair said it best to me yesterday. He said, this is not revolution, this is evolution, which kind of blew me away when you said that. So thanks for that. So that's where we're going. That's where we're coming from. I just want to move along and just talk a little bit about the composition of the board. I think we might be on slide 3 or something like that now. There's 11 organizations that are representing this work. And let me tell you this, since I personally started doing the work of eradicating systemic racism and working to knock down some of these barriers, I have never seen an effort in terms of outside of the legislative process when we start talking about implementation and we start talking about the people that come to the table and the folks that do the work. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't give the folks over at VHCB, did I say it right, VHCB? A huge shout out, but I'll come back to that. But I've never seen this work implemented in such a methodical and impactful and just I don't even really know how to describe it, but what I see coming together in the LALB is nothing short of amazing, the work that's happening. So I want to give special shout outs to not just the VHCB, but also folks, individuals like Jess, who's sitting in the room right now, Kirsten, who's sitting in the room right now, Samantha, who's not here, but amazing, Pacific and others. There are folks who are really, really stepping up. And this work that's coming out of it is, to me, mind blowing. And that is a lot coming from me because I've seen so much of this work done, but I've never seen it done on this level. So again, back to you. Thank you so much for allowing us to have the opportunity because it's not being squandered. And just to keep the main thing and make the long story short, I came to ask you for some money. Because at the end of the day, if this work is not funded, it's not going to get done, period. And some will say that this is a $1.2 million request, and I'm telling you, it's really like a $4.8 million request. That's what I came to ask you for. Because what I came to ask you for is not just funding this 1 year in general, which will lock it down, but in a time period when we know that this type of work is so necessary here, where systemic racism at a minimum has been laid bare with the global pandemic. And here we are in a post-Floyd era, and we understand systemic racism like no other time in history, coinciding with the time where we have unprecedented levels of funding available to us, over $1 billion in ARPA funding that's available to us for use in matters such as this, as well as unprecedented budget surpluses. I would be a fool not to come in here and ask you for this money because we need it and it's there. The 11 organizations that are represented here are some of the organizations that have been doing this work throughout the entire time. Throughout the duration of this period, this six or so year period. These are not fly by night organizations. Let's talk a little bit about the context here for the creation of the board. I'm sorry, not the context. What am I saying? The priorities. Yeah, priorities. Thank you. I'm going to, instead of insulting you, could you please just take a quick look at the slide? And as I'm really talking through it, what we know based upon some of the information that I gave you, that of course there's a lot of historical barriers that exist. And we're talking about high walls. We're talking about breaking down some of these barriers that have existed since forever. So there's a lot of opportunity here for us here because what we know is that systemic racism, the definition, by definition, it is a political and it's an economic divide along racial lines, first of all. But we know that often opportunities are withheld from those with disabilities, from those who are in the LGBTQIA community. So these are very well thought out priorities and objectives that we're putting before you. This was the very first thing. We didn't back into this thing. The very first thing that this board did was they sat down and they said, where are we going? What are our objectives? So this is just kind of a sample of some of the guiding principles, if you will, of the organization. Let's talk about the report.
Mark, may I ask you a question first?
Of course.
When you sat down to do these priorities, one of the hardest parts of trying to even imagine what this could be is what you brought and what this group of people brought to the table. And one of the things, when I look at the lines, when I look at the Seek Out, Create, Fund, build alternative models for land access, finding home. One of the things about systemic racism that I'm aware of is the amount, and we talked about this with the healthcare, the reason there's a healthcare board, because carrying generations worth of this institutional racism, the stress it causes, the physical changes it causes, the emotional changes it causes. I'm just curious, when you sat down to make these priorities, were people all on the same page, or did you have to find your path in order to get to that point?
Mark, can I jump in? Or sorry, the honor's month.
Now let Mark, I mean, we'll get to you, Justin.
If, with your, with your permission, we'll bring in another witness after I answer this question.
Yeah.
So I think what's important to understand about this institutionalized trauma as it's coming from housing, education, employment, health services, economic development, transportation, it's insidious and it's simultaneous. So when we get into rooms and we're having conversations, we're fortunate to be able to plow through some of these challenges and be able to move past our trauma and to be able to have real conversations about where it is that we're going as a group. I think there's always trauma in the room, and these are difficult conversations that we've had. So I'm not sure, Mr. Chairman, if the question that you're asking me is related to the process, but if it is related to the process, I could just assure you that these processes are difficult, and I think that's where a lot of the work comes from. And I think that's where we should really be so proud of some of the work that this group has done, because there's been so many people who've come together from so many different backgrounds, who've brought into this board, their own experiences, but yet and still they've been able to figure out how to work through some of that to get to a point because everybody knows how important this work is, and they place that above even their own personal experiences. So, and I guess the too late for a short answer. The long answer to your question is really that folks. This is kind of a multi-pronged exercise. Even just to get to a point to where folks have been able to produce some type of product, some type of deliverable. There's also work going on, always work going on in the room as people show up, come together, and are processing their own personal experiences and bringing to the table and contributing and building something bigger than ourselves. With the chair's permission, if I could just truncate my testimony right now and offer my colleague an opportunity to swear in, would that be okay?
And she doesn't need to swear.
Swear in?
All I'm asking is.
Maybe swear at.
Oh, should I?
No, you can be heard. You can be heard on the microphone.
Okay.
I think that's.
So Jess Laporte, I'm a member of the Land Access Opportunity Board. I was a part of advocating for the creation of this board last year with a group called Seeding Power. And my seat is with the Everytown Project, which is about BIPOC land access. And I'm Black, so I often speak from a similar racial perspective on this. But something I want to highlight, if you can go back to the list of organizations, is beyond lived experience. These organizations were selected for a reason because they're skilled at addressing the barriers that the people that they serve face. And they do this on a community level. And actually a number of them, Kirsten is and Mark are a little bit of the anomalies, because many of these organizations are not in the State House. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work of these organizations, but they have particular constituents, many of whom are protected classes. And so in addition to the lived experience that many board members bring across these different protected classes, what they're also bringing is the skills of developing solutions tailored to those protected classes. So when we sit down to look at the priorities, we were very literally pulling from some of the organizational priorities or vision statements or programs that some of these organizations already have. I know Everytown was looked to because they are specifically working in land access, which is actually one of the only things that makes it unique on that list, is that many of these organizations don't work directly on land and housing access. They work on creating really a full menu of solutions to address equity issues for the people that they serve. So the priorities is kind of, I personally see coming to the board and participating in the board is a particular table that I come to. There's one that is a state board. So when I'm there, I'm thinking about what can the state do, like this committee, to be engaged in housing and land equity work. And there's already other work happening around the state. The other thing that I asked, it's also, this work is particular to land and housing access, which is not the same for all of these organizations. I wouldn't say that housing and land is at the center of what the Pride Center does every day. But if you flip it and you actually think about this is a skill set that the Pride Center has to connect to and to connect members of the LGBT community to the resources at the local, state, and federal level that are available to them. So when we wrote our priorities, it's coming out of that experience of being members or staff or board members of these organizations that are deeply embedded in the community. And I think that that's a really important mechanism in this board that is unique from some of the other state boards, but is more similar to boards like the Health Advisory Council, Health Equity Advisory Council. I'm bad at acronyms, but I just want to highlight that because this is actually a really huge service that this board and other equity boards can offer to you all as legislators. Is you all are here and y'all live somewhere in the state, but you all are here in the session. And these organizations, they're in their communities and meeting with people one-on-one and bringing that experience into a state institution.
Thank you. I interrupted you.
Thank you, Jess. Appreciate that.
And I appreciate your answer. It is a process question, but it's also a reality question of it's too easy for us to just go, oh, a summer study committee, this person or this person have roles to play and they play them. This was different. This was a different approach.
It comes from a very stressful place. I want to, before I pivot over to our attorney, many of you know Robert Appel, who's been around since the building was built. And I think it might be important also to emphasize the fact that this work, there are two things that have to happen at the same time. Bless you. We have to be able to cut off or stop the incessant production of these outcomes that create these outcomes that create disparities in our communities. I'm trying to be nice about it, but I should just say it. So what we got to do is we need to cut it off. And how we try to do that is with policy. And we try to adjust policy. We write new policy. We adjust existing policies. We want to try to stop it. We want to try to figure it out. Everybody around this table feels the same way. We want to, if there's anything that we're doing as a state that's creating adverse outcomes in any community, I'm sure everybody around this table says, yeah, we want to stop that. That's one thing. But the other thing is that we have to remember, those of us who are in community, to Jess's point, is we have to deal with the impact. Because there's a lot of impact that's happening in our communities. I have a community engagement and support director. We work out of the Richard Kim Center in Burlington, and a lot of programs and services that have historically been inefficient, ineffective, or in some cases non-existent. Those are the things that we need to be focusing on in those efforts. So there's a lot of things that we're doing at the same time. So you'll see some things happening. As I said, it's not just linear. There's a lot of things happening at the same time. So I just wanted to leave that with you, because you're right, Mr. Chair. It is very stressful, and there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of pain. There's a lot of trauma that folks are working through, to include myself, that folks are working through to try to get this work done, because we know that my best constituent is me, because I am just equally impacted. I just, for some odd reason, have some ability to be able to show up in places like this and be able to have these kind of conversations, but it's not an easy conversation. It's not easy work. It's not easy to do. So that being said, before we go to Robert, are there any quick questions that we have on this side before we get into the technical stuff that Robert's going to do? I don't know anything about.
Committee questions for Mark? No, I want to thank you for, a minute.
No. I saw the question face. They go like, the eyes go.
I'll see it, right?
Yeah. I was hoping you had a question. I love your questions.
So the chair said this is not a summer study committee. Obviously, it's not. And I'm just wondering, I mean, the work of this board will never be done.
Never.
So do you see this as a permanent feature of the state? Is this the work of this board?
I do. And I'm glad you asked that question because it really speaks volumes, what you just said. And I don't know why I didn't say it. I mean, I guess I'm not as smart as you. The thing is that
It's probably just so obvious to you.
maybe it's obvious. And the thing is that it's not just about the board, it's about the work.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the state, it's about us. It's about our lives. It's about how we frame this in our own lives. Because this is not something, if we're bold enough to say that we're going to eradicate systemic racism, as an example, that's a life commitment. This is not legislative work. This is not community work. This is life work that we're talking about doing because there has to be a paradigm shift. Is that for me? Janet likes me. But there has to be a paradigm shift in us, in our hearts, if we really want to do this work. And you can tell when it isn't because people get tired, they sit down, they go away, they stop, they give up, they stop giving money, they stop bringing it up in committees, they stop talking about it in the legislature, they stop doing the work in the communities. But it's not done, and it never will be done because it took hundreds of years for us to get to where we are today. And the narrative of white supremacy is not a fallacy in the sense that it just poof disappears and if we can just wish it away. It takes work. It takes, if it's insidious, if it's consistent, if it's persistent, if it's simultaneous, if it's historic, if it's tied to our history, then that means we're going to spend the rest of our lives just moving the needle so our kids can come to a point to where they can pick the work up and move it to the next level. And if we don't, then that's just going to leave our kids at that much more of a disadvantage because somebody's going to have to keep doing this work. Thanks for that question. I've taken too much time. Unless, with your permission, Mr. Chair, can we go to Robert Appel?
Absolutely. Robert, are you there?
I am. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. I wish I were there with you. Unfortunately, I'm down with the flu. It's sort of, I'm not a fan of remote platforms. I can't really see you all. You can see me, which I'm not much to look at given my current state, but here we are. So thank you, Mark. Thanks for that overview. Mr. Chair, I see we're almost out of the allotted time. What's your intention in terms of how long you will continue to hear from us on this measure? And I'll tailor my comments.
Well, can you speak at 1.5 or just kidding? No, we're going to go right up till 2:00. So if that's enough time for you to start, at least.
Yeah, it is.
Go from there.
Okay, great. So I think your chair and Mark gave a good overview of how we got to where we are today before you with the request for an ongoing appropriation. And I think Mark nailed it when he said 4.8 over 4 years. This is ongoing work. And I would remind the committee, and I think part of my role in consulting with the board is to address the legality, the constitutional challenges that have apparently been raised by your legislative council in the last session. I was not involved in the discussion last year, but for those of you who know me, I've been involved in many discussions with Leg Council over the years. I don't know many of you. I'll do a quick introduction. I've been involved in law for 45 years. I gained admission to the bar almost 40 years ago after doing a reading law clerkship as a civil rights investigator in the AG's office. I worked in public defense. I worked in the AG's office as an investigator and lead attorney of the Civil Rights Division, and have been back and forth between civil rights enforcement and criminal defense, including prominent positions as Defender General before Matt Valerio served 8.5 years, and then I was executive director of the Human Rights Commission for the first decade of this millennium, I guess it is. So I'm certainly familiar with the issues, of which there are many. I would remind the committee that the manner in which this bill was drafted and passed is not just about systemic racism, which is there's all sorts of isms. We all know that. And this is one of the first measures I've seen from our legislature in following your work for 40 years that acknowledges that and tries to address bias across the board. And from a legal perspective, I think that makes it more defensible from attack about racial preference, etc. I would encourage you to read the report, at least the overview of the legal landscape that gives a pretty good and relatively brief explanation of where we believe the ongoing work of this board, we hope, dependent on continued funding, it is immune from viable constitutional attack. The report does what you asked it to do, which provides legal, constitutional, and governance overview of the work we've undertaken. It's true that getting a new body of government up and running takes time. I started in November. I see Truth and Reconciliation taking some time to get going. I'm glad I learned over time. I've not been in the legislature since I retired from state service 10 years ago. But I learned over time it's always helpful to put timeframes in for appointment of members and first meetings. I'm not sure that happened here, but the people who are committed to this work made it happen. So again, it's a very, very broad mandate. It includes categories, protected categories, which have been traditionally limited to, quote, immutable characteristics. It goes beyond that, talks about socioeconomic status, which is nowhere defined in our statute, and there's very little case precedent about that. But as a resident of North Central Vermont for the last 50 plus years, I know a lot of poor white folks who are also left behind. And I think by embracing the whole range of disadvantaged and marginalized populations, irrespective of race or previously recognized protected category status, and you'll see in the report, I think we're committed to removing barriers and abide by the adage, a rising tide floats all boats. And I think that's a critical part of the work that's being undertaken. I would agree with Mark. I've been involved in many of these meetings and initiatives over the past 40 years. And I must say, this is up there in terms of its effectiveness and collegiality among its membership. I do have to say a little bit about this notion of Vermont exceptionalism, that we're better than the rest of the country. If you look back at our history, unfortunately, it's not so true. This is the last day of Black History Month, as many of you know. I've been very excited to do the work in this context. I've learned a lot by reading some of the materials that are outlined in the bibliography and waiting for this committee to start. I looked up the experience of Buffalo soldiers who were here in 1909 at Fort Easton Allen, now Camp Johnson. And they were excoriated and told to stay out of town because they were Black, out of Burlington. It's a remarkable history that we choose not to acknowledge. The Ku Klux Klan was very active in Vermont in the 20s. There's pictures, there's a book called Fiery Crosses in the Green Mountain State that has photographs of 10,000 hooded folks in a field in Barrie in the 20s. So, you know, we like to think of ourselves as separate and apart from the rest of the nation, but we're not. We're not. The governmental systemic discrimination of the federal government has filtered down to the states, including Vermont. I could go on and on about well, in the late 50s, UVM started a football team. They were recruiting a running back who happened to be Black. He couldn't find a place to stay in town, which is one of the reasons Vermont enacted a public accommodation bill. You know, We have to learn from our past mistakes, and we have to devote the resources to avoid these unfortunate events happening not only to us, but as Mark says, to our children and grandchildren. The enactment of this legislation is consistent with the legislative authority in the Constitution to promote the general welfare of the entirety of the state's people. I don't think they're legally or constitutionally controversial in the way they're being designed. We're very cognizant of the potential for, reverse discrimination challenges. We're very, very mindful in our work to try to avoid giving fuel to such an action. And again, being cognizant of the time, I'm going to stop there. I threw a lot out in 5 or 8 minutes. So if people have questions, I'm happy to try to answer them, and always happy to come back, hopefully in person, if you'd like to discuss anything I said in greater detail. Again, I would recommend you spend some time with the report. I think you'll find it worthwhile reading. Thank you.
Questions for Robert? Robert, dealing with this particular process, in terms of approaching the legal parts of it, the research, did you do the research and bring it back to the committee?
I did. And for a while, I was working with Anthony Europino, who veered off in another direction. But yeah, we worked on it jointly for a while, and for the last 2 months, it's basically been new.
And can you go back one slide? Can we go back one slide to the this argument that you make? No, I'm sorry. Go the other direction. In the second, can you talk about the second bullet point, please?
Yeah, 30 seconds or less.
You have 45 to 300 seconds. No, take your time.
So, in the report, there's reference to this case pending before the U.S. Supreme Court, brought by Asian American students against Harvard University and the University of North Carolina, alleging that race as a criteria in any measure violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment because it disadvantages non-African American or Black candidates. Knowing the way our court has been kind of put "our" in quotes because it doesn't feel like my court, I'll tell you, has been heading, I anticipate a decision that will totally ban the consideration of race, ethnicity, or other groups of people who have been historically marginalized or disadvantaged, gaining any advantage in trying to level the playing field. There have been arguments in the past that there was a compelling state interest in providing diverse learning environments from which both white students and minority students can benefit from exposure to others. That's been rejected. The bigger question to me is how compelling will the analysis be if the action is brought in the Vermont Supreme Court, which has not said a whole lot about equal protection other than State v. Baker. We have a parallel clause to the Equal Protection Clause called the Common Benefits Clause. It's in Chapter 1, Article 7, which is what Baker versus State was decided on, that there was no compelling state interest in not providing marriage licenses to same-sex couples. So to date, that's the only notable case decided under our state constitution's provision, which is parallel to the Equal Protection Clause. When the Supreme Court started veering rightward, probably Rehnquist on, there's been a movement in Vermont and other jurisdictions to look to state constitution for independent grounds, and you're seeing it in the abortion question. Other states are looking, as we did here, looking to state sovereign constitutional provisions to avoid the dramatic and negative impact of what I consider to be draconian and wrong-headed decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court. I don't know if that's helpful. That was probably somewhere in the 92nd, but I don't know if that fills in any gaps for you, Mr. Chair.
Well, it does. I mean, without understanding what the 14th Amendment, the federal 14th Amendment does, it's hard to, and you know, the first bullet point, you know, discusses how the interpretation of the 14th Amendment has changed a little bit, quite a bit. And I just want to make sure we have that stated and we have you know, access to the information so that we know when we look at the report and think about how we want to move forward with recommendations. I just want to make sure we know that this work is up against, on the face of it, not all of the work, as you pointed out, as Mark pointed out, but that some of this work is really constitutionally fraught, but it's not in this report. This is the work of the board.
Right. Well, there's a rather lengthy attachment E, legal primer on equal protection civil rights laws as it relates to the work of this board that was jointly written by Anthony and me. I think it provides the detail you're looking for. I have some sense of what your reading piles look like. They're immense. But if you, the information's there if you can find the time to dig into it.
Everybody on the committee got a copy of this for the weekend, so.
But your weekends are busy. I know you have to recover. I mean, the work you've taken on as elected representatives is daunting, given the resources provided. So I thank you for your service.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you for your, I can't kick you off yet. Representative Chestnut Tangerman?
I just think a little bit slower than everybody else. Some of the questions come right at the end.
You know these fast talking lawyers, right?
But on the previous slide, your first bullet point talked about weaponization of the 14th Amendment.
Right.
And which we see in other areas as well. You know, recently in the Carson versus Macon decision, I would say affecting funding of religious institutions, of religious schools. And I'm just wondering, I mean, that just seems to when the framework that you are depending on of non-discrimination and common benefit gets upended like that, how do you do your work?
I think we have to look to the state constitution. I don't know how many of you may remember this, but there was a case involving the town of Chittenden School District, which was seeking religious funding. And our state court said, no, it's violation of establishment of religion clause in our constitution. I mean, the state should not, in my opinion, and has been my opinion has held sway for many, many, many years that government and religion are separate entities and should not entangle one another. We now have a 6-3 court that takes a very different view, and a number of those members were put on the court by our last president just for this reason. And it's an unfortunate reality we have to find our ways around. And I think looking to actions in state court and state constitution makes sense. And I know Mark worked long and hard on the abolishment of slavery in the Constitution, and it goes into, the report goes into some detail about the passage of the 13th Amendment after the Civil War, which did away with slavery except for imprisonment for crimes. And in southern states, legislatures made it unlawful for Black people to be idle. So they were arrested and put on chain gangs doing the same work they were doing as slaves on plantations, but this time in chains with white guys holding guns at them. So our history is checkered at best, and the more you learn about it, the more horrifying it is. And you know, I thought I was fairly up to snuff on this stuff, but my reading over the last 2 months is just keeps shaking my head and said, you can't make this stuff up. This is like unbelievable. And you know, unfortunately, our current president has this tendency of, when there's racist incidents, says this is not who we are. But in fact, that's our history. Other questions?
If there's nothing else, I have a comment.
Sure.
And a statement of gratitude and appreciation before we take a break and end this portion of the conversation. It's a statement of gratitude for all of you folks and all of the 11 organizations that are a part of this and that have been doing the work, and to the legislature as well for acknowledging this. And it's really just a testament to all the conversation that has taken place, the testimony that's taken place this morning, or this afternoon, in understanding and actualizing. Thank you for presenting that question, Chair Stevens, of what the process and experience is like as people with lived experience who are trying to set aside our own experiences to do the things. And so when I say our and I, because I am included in that as a woman of color, as a Black woman who has a seat at this table right now. And so I wanted to extend an offer of gratitude for your continued work in this life work that is taking place, and in this effort to keep bringing this up to restore or repair the systemic oppression and racism that has taken place and all of the systems in our country, because our history is charted as checkered at best. And in that, one thing before we take break, if I could, because it is the last day of Black History Month, I very intentionally didn't want to be that person to have to bring it up, because as a Black woman, I feel like I shouldn't have to. I feel like other people should be like, hey, let's acknowledge this thing. But I just wanted to share a poem that I often share with folks in honor and in this conversation that resonates with me deeply on a regular level. And it's Won't You Celebrate With Me by Lucille Clifton. Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model. Born in Babylon, both non-white and woman, what did I see to be except myself? I made it up. Here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and failed. And I say that because this is ongoing work. There's so much work to be done. And I have so much gratitude for this body, for this committee, for taking this on. And I hope it doesn't end here. And I hope that everyone that I get to serve with sees the value in my experience that I bring to the table, and that my colleagues that I share outside of this community bring to the table, and see the value in what this means and how it shapes the lives of so many Vermonters who are often excluded and forgotten, because when we're not intentionally included, we get excluded and forgotten by default. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Lamont. Can I just say, echo what Mark said, that the legislature has been on a path towards equity, and I have to give a shout out to your chair. I mean, I was around in the battle for state recognition of Indigenous peoples here. Chairman Stevens' work at recognizing those who died at the state hospital and were forgotten, and his pushing forward for the legislative branch to issue an apology for eugenics, which is why federal recognition was not bestowed on Indigenous people here, because they had to go underground. So we are on a path together, and I think we all have to realize we have a long way to go, and we need to keep pushing. So thank you.
Thank you, Robert. We just want to cap the testimony. Jess, microphone first.
Yeah, so I'm just stepping in for Mark to Jess Laporte. Oh, and I didn't say where I live before. I'm in Duxbury, Vermont. So I'm just going to try to cap this off with a few really important points around the legal framework for this board, because we know that constitutionality is something that we were really up against in trying to create the board, and why it was meaningful that the $200,000 that was appropriated for this fiscal year was used for legal counsel. And as is summarized, but I just want to highlight that we believe that the legal framework that is being used is, I don't know what this is called, pose a de minimis legal risk to the state of Vermont. And that is because, and it's laid out in the report, I would really, especially as a board that's working, as a body that's working on equity issues, constitutionality is being raised consistently when you're trying to direct state funds to protected classes. So in our case, what is laid out in the report is a mechanism to lean on the skills and existing networks of community organizations to enact the work, but not having restrictions. This is when we grow to a place to be able to re-grant funding and redistribute state funding. We are going to work with community-based organizations that might work with particular protected classes. That's the skill set I was talking about earlier in access to, connection to, and skills and solution building for them, and grant to those bodies to actually enact the program. So not having the LAOB, which was in earlier drafts of this, be the actual kind of program running body, the way that other state institutions, individuals might apply for state funding for a particular program. With the LAOB, we would be looking to do re-granting work with community-based organizations who then are developing those solutions. So that is the part around constitutionality. I would really encourage visiting that because that is one of the major challenges that this board has seen from the beginning. And so I don't know if that felt new and different to you, Chair Stevens, and maybe you can help to contextualize that with this body of just how this has gone on an arc from H273 to where we are now, and how the report does address constitutionality. I think that's an important piece. That's what will kind of pop to the surface. The other thing I want to emphasize is the budget that we're requesting. We see this as a capacity building minimum operational budget for this body. There are some particular goals in this first year around doing some assessments in order to build programs and doing assessments in order to step into that advisory power that's laid out in the statute. That advisory power includes VHCB, it includes working lands, it includes other housing and land authorities across the state. And I want to really emphasize that by resourcing this board, we can also begin to build some efficiencies across the state. Rather than every new body creating a report, doing research, hiring consultants, this board can begin to be a partner to all these other instrumentalities of the state as it relates to equity and land and housing access. So we have a number of programs that cut only on this line of economics, right? You qualify based on household income or individual income. And this board is hopefully going to create some deeper mechanisms to deal with the complex intersection of marginalization that most people experience. We aren't, to Sadia's poem, we aren't just Black, we might be women. We aren't just Black, we might be disabled. And there are complex systems that need to be addressed. So the budget that we've laid out for 1 year is 1.2 million, but we believe that a one-time 4.8 million appropriation would allow us to truly establish the capacity of this board for longevity into the future. And without investing in executive director, staffing, and other research of this body, we're not going to see the effectiveness of it. And we're going to continue as a state to have this constellation of equity programs. And I think in housing and land access, the LAOB can be a good place to consolidate efforts. I don't think that there was anything else that I wanted to emphasize. That this body will continue to exist under VHCB. As per the report, that's another opportunity for efficiency. VHCB is very well equipped to manage being a state instrumentality. And so we thought that it was very strategic to stick with them and to partner with them in this work. And I think that that's it, unless there are questions about kind of the budget or going back to constitutionality, because I know that was an important point from last year.
And I think we've got to take a break, but I also just want to appreciate that the board has gotten to that point, because I remember a year ago, the conversations were, we were battling over what's in house, and now it's the whys. And so I appreciate that the report addresses all of those things, which is again, what we had intended. when we created it. And I just want to thank you for your perseverance and your participation in the board, and we will be addressing this in our conversations over the next couple of days.
Great. We hope to hear from you, and we hope
Always
that
available on YouTube.
that the LAOB can be a partner to other work that you're doing. We really see the work that the LAOB is doing as in step with the Truth and Reconciliation and the Health Equity Board. We have a lot of overlap in constituents and community organizations, and we think that we really are building kind of the team that it will take to move this forward. So we hope that we can partner with bodies like this as you're doing your equity work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time today.
Gus, you don't need to chime in, do you?
I'm going to take that as there's only one answer, and it's no, I don't need to chime in other than thank you for giving a hearing today. And we hope you'll provide support in the budget process, and we're prepared to move forward as an administrative home.
Great, thank you. All right, committee, we're going to take, please, 5 minutes. We are going to run a little bit longer than our agenda, but just take 5 to 7